The smell of my father's death was less like rot and more like the dry, static-charged air of an old television left on a dead channel. Arthur didn't leave behind a sentimental legacy. He left a heavy, iron key to a storage unit on the outskirts of town and a silence that felt like a physical weight in my chest. I sat in his old home office now, the single flickering desk lamp casting long, jagged shadows against the peeling wallpaper. The air was thick with the scent of dust and ancient ink. On the desk sat a single, unmarked manila folder I'd recovered from that concrete tomb, a collection of classified facility conduct notes from his time at NASA in the 80s. The paper felt brittle, like dried skin. I opened it, and the void stared back. The first rule was scrawled in my father's precise, frantic handwriting: never talk about Roswell. It wasn't a weather balloon or an alien scout ship. The documents described it as a massive, messy containment failure. But the warning wasn't about the event itself. It was about the attention. Arthur's notes whispered that merely speaking of the incident made you dangerously visible. It was like a beacon in the dark, lighting up your soul for those who spend their lives silencing the truth. To speak was to invite a shadow into your home that would never leave. It was a cognitive infection, a way for the watchers to find your frequency and tune in. I turned the page, my fingers trembling. Rule 2. If you see green slugs in the break room, never use salt. There was a grainy, black and white photograph clipped to the page. It showed a janitor's closet and something slick and emerald-colored on the floor. The report detailed a janitor who had tried to dissolve the pests with common table salt. He didn't kill them. The sodium acted as a horrific catalyst, a chemical trigger that caused the slugs to swell and tear open. They didn't die. They mutated, their soft bodies splitting into jagged, multi-limbed horrors that didn't belong in this dimension. The janitor was never found, only a trail of brine and something that looked like liquefied bone. The third rule was even colder: do not ask about missing scientists. The folder contained spreadsheets of names, dozens of them, with red lines drawn through their histories. They weren't just fired, they were flawlessly erased from a system, their records wiped as if they had never drawn breath. Arthur's notes warned that asking about a missing colleague was treated by the facility as a formal request to be erased next. Curiosity wasn't a trait at NASA, it was a death sentence. You didn't mourn, you just looked at the empty desk and pretended there had always been a void there. Rule 4 detailed a cynical game. If a government official demands answers, pretend you're complying. The documents laid out a complex choreography of deception. NASA didn't answer to the government, they performed for it. They staged elaborate, fake tours for oversight committees, leading men in suits through corridors of busy work and empty labs, making them feel powerful while the truly anomalous layers of the facility remained hidden beneath their feet. The officials were children playing in a sandbox while the real monsters were being fed in the basement, hidden behind plywood facades and fabricated reports. Then there was the fifth rule, the one that hit closest to home: never bring your dog to work. I remembered Barnaby, our old golden retriever. The incident logs showed Arthur had brought him in one late night. There was a photo of Barnaby, hair standing on end, legs locked in a state of absolute, paralyzed terror. He wasn't barking at a person or a sound. He was staring at an ordinary, unmarked steel door. The note said the dog could sense a profound, ancient danger that human senses were too dull to detect. Barnaby was never the same after that night. He spent the rest of his life shivering in corners, staring at nothing, as if he could still see the thing behind the door through the walls of our house. The final rule felt like a cold blade against my throat: never let your child out alone after dark. Arthur had mapped out patterns: missing children, cattle mutilations, disappearances that local police called accidents. He discovered the entities that hunt on the fringes. They don't strike in the heart of a city. They wait for the target to wander just far enough away from the structures of man, just an inch too deep into the shadows where the light doesn't reach. They are the things that live in the static, the hunger that waits for a lapse in vigilance. I looked up from the folder, the flickering lamp dying a slow death. I looked at the window, the same window my father had spent decades standing in front of, staring out into the pitch-black yard. I used to think it was work stress, the weight of the Cold War and the secrets of the stars. But looking at the empty dark now, I realized he wasn't reflecting. He wasn't resting. My father was a sentry. He spent his life watching the tree line, standing guard against the things he knew were out there, waiting for the light to fail. And now, the lamp flickered one last time and died, leaving me alone in the dark he had feared so much. The darkness didn't just feel like the absence of light. It felt heavy, like wet wool draped over my face, smelling of cedar dust and my father's old tobacco. I sat there in the silence of his office, the dead lamp still warm to the touch, and felt the weight of the folder in my lap. I reached for the heavy brass lighter on his desk, the one with the NASA insignia worn smooth by his thumb. The flame flickered, a tiny, trembling yellow tooth gnawing at the shadows. It revealed the folder, ivory-colored and stained with the ghosts of coffee rings. The label didn't say NASA. It didn't have a department code. It just said, Conduct. I opened it. The first page wasn't a memo. It was a warning, written in my father's jagged, frantic shorthand. He used to say that some secrets were like radiation. You didn't have to touch them for them to kill you. You just had to be in the same room. Rule 1. The Roswell warning. Never talk about Roswell. I expected talk of flying saucers and almond-eyed grey men. What I found was a series of Polaroids that made the air in my lungs turn to static. The photos showed a landscape that looked less like a crash site and more like a slaughterhouse designed by a god who had forgotten the meaning of symmetry. My father's notes described it not as a vehicle failure, but as a containment rupture. Roswell wasn't a ship from the stars. It was a hole. A place where the fabric of the world had grown thin and eventually tore, vomiting a slurry of biological matter and non-Euclidean geometry onto the desert floor. The warning wasn't about the event itself, but the visibility it created. Arthur had written, talking about it is a beacon. They don't just monitor the frequencies, they monitor the intent. To speak of the rupture is to invite the gaze of the things that crawled out of it. It makes you a jagged edge in a smooth world. It makes you visible to the silencers, the men who aren't men, who move through the facility floors without casting shadows. If you speak the name of the place, you become a target for the unmaking. I felt a cold sweat prickle my spine. I looked toward the window, the dark glass reflecting nothing but my own pale, terrified face. I turned the page, my fingers trembling so hard the paper rattled like dry leaves. Rule 2. The mutating slugs. If you see green slugs in the break room, never use salt. This section was accompanied by a clinical report dated August 12, 1984. The lighting in the attached photos was a harsh, sickly green, the kind of fluorescent hum that makes your teeth ache. The report detailed an incident involving a janitor named Miller. He had found a cluster of translucent, emerald-colored slugs pulsating near the coffee machine. They looked like rotting grapes, vibrating with a low-frequency hum that Miller reported feeling in his marrow. Thinking they were a common pest, Miller had poured a canister of industrial salt over them. The reaction wasn't dehydration. It was a catalyst. The description that followed was a descent into pure revulsion. The salt didn't kill the slugs. It acted as a frantic, violent fuel for a cellular explosion. The slugs didn't die, they unzipped. They tore open, their soft bodies hardening into jagged, obsidian-like shards that didn't just grow, they replicated through the air. The photos showed Miller, or what was left of him. He hadn't been eaten. He had been incorporated. His skin had become a pale, translucent membrane stretched over a lattice of green, pulsating crystals. His eyes had been pushed out of their sockets by emerging stalks that twitched with a hideous, rhythmic intelligence. The note said the slugs weren't animals. They were biological sensors left behind by the things from the rupture. They fed on the mundane, on the salt of the earth, and when provoked, they forced everything around them to mutate, to become part of a singular, rotting hive. My father's handwriting here was nearly illegible, the ink smeared as if he'd been weeping or shaking when he wrote it. Salt makes them remember what they used to be. And what they used to be is hungry. I could almost hear the sound in the silence of the office, a wet, sliding noise, the sound of something soft dragging itself across linoleum. I looked down at the floorboards, half expecting to see a trail of glowing slime emerging from the shadows under the desk. The air felt thick, humid with the smell of ozone and spoiled meat. Rule 3. The vanishing personnel. Do not ask about missing scientists. This was a list. Pages and pages of names. Men and women my father had worked with for years. Dr. Aries, Sarah Jenkins, Thomas Thorne. Beside each name was a red stamp, erased. Not fired. Not retired. Erased. Arthur had written that NASA didn't just remove people from the payroll, they removed them from the memory of the system. Their keycards would stop working. Their files would vanish. If you went to their homes, you would find a different family living there, people who had been there for a decade, people who had never heard of a scientist named Thorne. Asking about them was treated as a voluntary submission. To acknowledge the void where a human being used to be was to signal that you were no longer compatible with the illusion. It meant you were the next one to be scrubbed from reality, your entire existence vacuumed out of the timeline until not even a thumbprint remained. The revulsion I felt wasn't just physical anymore. It was an existential sickness. My father hadn't just been a scientist. He had been a witness to a slow-motion genocide of identity. He had watched his friends vanish into the mouth of the facility and had to pretend, every single morning, that they had never existed at all. He had sat in the break room, sipping bitter coffee under those jaundiced green lights, nodding at the empty chairs where his colleagues used to sit, knowing that the moment he spoke their names, the slugs or the silencers or the void itself would come for him too. I looked at the folder, the edges fraying, the secrets within feeling like a heavy, cold weight pulling me down into the floor. The flashlight flickered. The shadows in the corners of the office seemed to lean in, curious, as if the rules themselves were a scent they could track. I realized then that my father wasn't just being paranoid. He wasn't a victim of some Cold War breakdown. He was a sentry. He had spent his life standing at that window, staring into the tree line, because he knew that the facility didn't end at the gates. The things they had let in at Roswell, the things that grew in the salt, the things that erased men from history, they were all out there, waiting in the dark. And by reading these rules, by understanding the conduct, I hadn't just inherited a storage unit. I had inherited the visibility. I had become a beacon. I looked at the window again. The tree line was a wall of black static against the charcoal sky. Something moved. A shape that didn't have a name. Something that moved with a jagged, hitching gait that defied the laws of biology. It was just at the edge of the light, waiting for the battery in my hand to fail. Waiting for me to speak a name. Waiting for me to become a volunteer. I gripped the lighter until the metal bit into my palm. My father had stood here for 30 years. He had never left the post. He had died so I wouldn't have to know, but now the seal was broken. The salt was on the slugs. The light died again, a final, hollow click, and in the absolute blackness of the office, I heard a wet, sliding sound coming from the hallway. Something was in the house. Something that didn't belong in this version of the world. And it was moving toward the door. The wet, rhythmic dragging sound stopped just outside the heavy oak door of my father's office. It was a sound like raw meat being pulled over broken glass, a heavy, airless friction that made the hair on my neck stand into jagged needles. I pressed my back against the cold metal of the filing cabinet, my breath hitching in a throat that felt like it was lined with rusted wool. The cold blue moonlight filtered through the slats of the blinds, slicing the room into high-contrast strips of silver and abyssal black. In that flickering, dying light, I fumbled with a folder, my thumbs slick with sweat against the yellowed parchment. My father's handwriting, once so clinical and precise, had devolved into a frantic, jagged scrawl as I turned the page to the third rule. Rule 3, do not ask about missing scientists. The words weren't just a warning, they were an obituary for the living. Below the header, Arthur had taped a series of internal NASA memos from 1984, each stamped with a deep violet ink that read void. I looked at the first photograph pinned to the page. It was a man named Dr. Elias Thorne, a lead astrophysicist with eyes that looked like they had seen the birth of a dead star. In the first photo, he was standing at a chalkboard covered in equations that seemed to writhe like centipedes. In the next photo, taken only 24 hours later, the chalkboard was there, the desk was there, but Elias was gone. Not just gone from the room, but gone from the image. There was a blurry, static-filled smudge where his body had been, a distortion in the film that looked like a thumbprint of God pressed into the reality of the office. My father's notes beneath the photo were a descent into madness. He wrote about the silence that followed a disappearance. It wasn't a morning silence. It was a hungry, predatory erasure. When Dr. Thorne didn't show up for the morning briefing, no one called his home. No one checked the labs. By noon, his security badge had been deactivated and his name had been scrubbed from the payroll archives by a script that didn't seem to have a human author. Arthur wrote that the most terrifying part wasn't the vanishing itself, but the reaction of the colleagues. If you mentioned Elias, if you even looked at his empty chair for too long, the air in the room would grow thick and metallic, smelling of ozone and rotting flowers. Asking a question about a missing person was seen as an invitation. It was a signal to the system that you were too observant, too tethered to the old version of the world. Arthur described it as volunteering. To ask, "Where is Elias?" was to say, "I am ready to follow him into the static." I stared at the door, the silence on the other side more terrifying than the sliding sound had been. Was that what was in the hall? A smudge of a man? A collection of erased memories trying to find a shape to inhabit? My father had survived 40 years by becoming a ghost while he was still breathing, by perfecting the art of looking through people until they were nothing but transparent shadows. He had learned to treat the void like a co-worker. The shadows in the office seemed to deepen, the blue light turning a bruised, sickly violet. I turned the page, the paper rasping like a final breath. Rule 4. If a government official demands answers, pretend you're complying. This section was thicker than the others, stuffed with architectural blueprints that made my head throb. They weren't blueprints of a facility, they were blueprints of a stage. My father had been a master of the Potemkin village. He detailed the oversight tours, where senators and generals in crisp, starched uniforms were led through a labyrinth of fake laboratories and high-tech theater. They were shown flashing lights, spinning reels of magnetic tape, and white-coated actors performing mundane chemistry experiments that meant absolutely nothing. NASA, or the thing that lived inside its skin, had constructed an entire floor of the facility, Level 9, as a grand illusion. The officials were given total access badges that only opened doors to rooms filled with hollow equipment. They were manipulated into believing they were the masters of the domain, while the true anomalies, the things that bled through the walls and hummed in frequencies that shattered human bone, were tucked away in the blind spots of the architecture. Arthur's notes were visceral here, describing the officials as cattle being led through a velvet-lined chute. He wrote about the grey men, the handlers who whispered scripts into the ears of the scientists before the tours began. The paranoia in the text was infectious. Arthur believed that the government didn't even know what it was funding. They thought they were building rockets and satellites, but they were actually feeding a leviathan that lived in the basement of the reality we call home. He had photos of these tours, high-contrast silhouettes of men in fedoras standing before giant, glowing screens that showed nothing but scrolling static. The faces of the officials were always blurred, not by the camera, but by a deliberate application of shadow. They were being fed a lie so complete that it became their only truth. I looked up from the folder, the cold blue light of the room suddenly feeling like part of the deception. Was this office even real? Was the house? My father had spent his life building walls to hide the rot, and now I was sitting in the middle of his masterpiece. The air in the office began to vibrate, a low-frequency hum that I felt in my molars. It was the sound of the machine behind the curtain, the sound of the real NASA, the one that didn't care about the moon or the stars, but about the things that crawled in the spaces between them. The wet sliding sound started again, but this time it wasn't in the hall. It was against the window. Something was dragging itself up the side of the house, a heavy, boneless weight that blocked out the moonlight as it passed. I watched the silhouette move across the blinds, a jagged, multi-limbed shape that didn't obey the laws of geometry. It stopped, its shadow stretching across the floor until it touched my feet. The conduct notes in my hand felt heavy, the ink bleeding into the paper as if the words themselves were trying to hide. My father hadn't just left me rules, he had left me a map of a minefield. Rule 3 and Rule 4 weren't just about his job, they were about the nature of the universe he had inhabited. A universe where you could be deleted like a typo, and where the people in charge were just puppets dancing for a puppeteer they couldn't see. I realized then that the silence of the house wasn't peace. It was the same silence that had followed Dr. Thorne's disappearance. It was the sound of the world being edited in real time. I was the only thing left in the room that hadn't been scrubbed yet. I gripped the folder tighter, the jagged edges of the paper cutting into my palms. The sliding sound was now directly above me, on the roof, a rhythmic thud drag that felt like a heartbeat. I looked at the notes one more time, focusing on a small, handwritten postscript at the bottom of the page on oversight. It said, "They think they are watching us, but we are only making sure they don't see what is watching them." A cold sweat broke across my skin. The paranoia wasn't just a feeling anymore, it was a physical weight, a pressure in the air that made it hard to swallow. The high-contrast shadows of the room seemed to detach themselves from the furniture, creeping toward me like spilled ink. I could feel the static of the vanishing beginning to itch at the back of my brain, a white noise hum that threatened to drown out my own thoughts. If I called for help, who would answer? The police? The government? They were the ones being led through the fake tours. They were the ones who would look at my empty house and see nothing but a vacancy, a name scrubbed from a lease, a life reduced to a smudge of graphite on a cold blue floor. I was alone in the dark with my father's ghosts, and the thing on the roof was starting to find its way in. I turned to Rule 5, my hand shaking so violently the paper rattled. The jagged, visceral reality of my father's life was closing in, and the office, this cold, blue, geometric cage was no longer a sanctuary. It was a stage, and the play was almost over. The void was leaning in, its breath smelling of ozone and the deep, pressurized cold of the vacuum, and I knew that if I didn't keep reading, if I didn't understand the rules perfectly, I would become just another missing scientist, another voluntary ghost in a facility that didn't exist. The handle of the door began to turn, slowly, with a sickening, metallic groan. It wasn't a hand turning it. It was something else, something that moved with the same wet, sliding intent as the thing on the roof. I held the folder to my chest, the only shield I had against the erasure, and waited for the door to open, my eyes fixed on the black void of the hallway where the silhouettes of the truth were waiting to be seen. The light flickered one last time, a dying spark in a guttering bulb, and in that microsecond of illumination, I saw it. Not a man, not a monster, but a gap in the world. A hole in the shape of a person, filled with the same shifting static I had seen in the photos of Elias Thorne. It didn't have a face, only a sense of profound, hollow hunger. It didn't belong here, but then again, after reading these rules, I realized that neither did I. The deception was complete. The oversight had failed. And the vanishing was about to begin. The fifth rule was scrawled in a script that looked like it had been carved with a bone. Never bring your dog to work. It seemed like a mundane request, a simple matter of corporate hygiene, or perhaps a nod to the sterile requirements of a high-security lab. But the photograph clipped to the page told a different story, a story of a collapse that had nothing to do with physics and everything to do with the soul. In the photo, my father's old golden retriever, Barnaby, was standing in a hallway that looked like the throat of a dead titan. The walls were lined with the same dull, leaden shielding I'd seen in the Roswell files, and the floor was a polished mirror of black epoxy. Barnaby wasn't barking. He wasn't growling. He was standing perfectly still in front of a door marked only with a series of mathematical symbols that seemed to shift if I looked at them too long. I remember Barnaby. He was a creature of pure, unadulterated sunlight, a dog that would wag his tail at a thunderstorm. But in that photo, he looked like he had been turned to salt. His fur was bristling in a way that defied the laws of anatomy, each hair standing up like a needle. His eyes were wide, the whites showing in a jagged ring around the pupils, and he was staring at that unmarked door with a level of concentrated, absolute dread that I didn't know an animal could possess. My father's handwritten note underneath the photo was a jagged serration of ink. Barnaby didn't see a ghost, it read. He didn't see a monster. He saw the absence. He smelled the void. To us, it's just a door. To them, it's an open wound in reality. Humans are deaf to the scream of the universe, but the dogs hear the tearing. I looked up from the folder, the flashlight in my hand flickering as if the air itself was becoming thick, pressurized by the weight of the secrets I was unearthing. The hallway of my father's house felt different now. The shadows weren't just the absence of light. They were heavy, leaning against the walls like tired, rotting things. I could almost feel Barnaby's terror radiating from the paper, a cold static that crawled up my arms and settled in the marrow of my bones. My father had brought the dog into the facility during an off-hour shift, thinking the animal's presence would soothe the mounting paranoia of his colleagues. Instead, Barnaby had walked 10 feet into the sublevel and simply stopped. He stayed in that exact position for 6 hours, refusing to move, refusing to blink, his heart beating so fast it eventually gave out. He died of sheer, unmitigated horror in front of a door that, to any human eye, was completely empty. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The entities my father had been monitoring weren't just physical threats. They weren't just green slugs or crashed pilots from a forgotten star. They were something more fundamental, something that occupied the spaces between our thoughts and the reality we thought we knew. They were the static on a dead channel, the rot in a basement you can never quite clean. And as I turned the page to the final rule, I felt the dread solidify into a cold, hard stone in my gut. Rule 6. Never let your child out alone after dark. This wasn't a rule for the facility. This was a rule for home. The documents attached to this final section were different from the others. They weren't official NASA memos or classified incident logs. They were maps of our town, hand-drawn and meticulously detailed. My father had circled dozens of locations in red ink, mostly parks, backyards, and the edges of the woods that bordered our property. Next to each circle was a date and a brief, clinical description. Cattle mutilation, 3 miles north. Missing child, age 7, last seen near the creek. Vanished while taking out the trash. I felt a wave of nausea. He hadn't just been a scientist, he had been a surveyor of a hunting ground. His notes explained the pattern. These things, these entities that the government had spent billions of dollars trying to contain and hide, didn't just stay in the labs. They leaked. They followed the light back to the sources of heat and life. They didn't hunt in packs, they hunted in the gaps. They waited for the moment a target wandered just far enough away from the protective shell of a building or a streetlight. They preyed on the solitary, the ones who stepped into the long shadows of the dusk and never stepped back out. Arthur's handwriting became a frantic scrawl toward the end. They don't eat the meat, he wrote. They eat the possibility. They take the child and leave the silence. They are attracted to the hum of the facility, but they are sustained by the isolation of the dark. I watched them from the sublevel windows for 20 years. I saw them drifting across the parking lot like patches of oily smoke. They don't have shapes until they find a witness. And once they find you, they never stop looking. The flashlight beam in my hand was dying, the circle of light shrinking until it was nothing more than a pale, jaundiced eye on the carpet. I looked toward the window of my father's old home office. For as long as I could remember, he had spent his evenings there. I used to think he was a workaholic, a man obsessed with the cold calculations of the space age, a man who preferred the company of stars to his own family. I remembered seeing him silhouetted against that glass, his back to me, staring out into the pitch-black yard for hours on end. He never spoke. He never turned around. He just stood there, a silent sentinel in a cardigan, watching the tree line. I walked over to the window now, my boots thudding softly on the floorboards. The yard outside was a black ocean, the trees swaying in a wind I couldn't hear. The darkness felt alive, a shifting, undulating mass that seemed to press its face against the glass, waiting for an invitation. I looked at the desk, where a single framed photo of me as a young boy Saturday. I was 5 years old, playing in the grass, and in the background, just at the edge of the woods, there was a smudge, a blur of grey static that looked like a hole torn in the film. My father hadn't been distant. He hadn't been cold. He had been a soldier in a war that had no front lines and no hope of victory. He had spent his entire life standing at this window, not out of stress, not out of duty to a government that would have erased him in a heartbeat, but out of a desperate, clawing love. He was the only thing standing between me and the hollow hunger that waited in the dark. He wasn't looking at the stars. He was looking for the things that lived between them. The flashlight finally died, plunging the room into a total, suffocating blackness. In the silence, I heard it. A soft, rhythmic scratching against the exterior siding of the house. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. It was the sound of something testing the perimeter, something that had been waiting for the watchman to die so it could finally come inside. I stood there in the dark, my father's folder clutched to my chest like a shield, and for the first time in my life, I understood the true meaning of his inheritance. It wasn't the house. It wasn't the money. It was the watch. I reached out and touched the cold glass of the window. Somewhere out there, in the void where the light ended and the nightmare began, something shifted. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, a sense of profound, hollow hunger. I didn't turn away. I didn't run. I stood exactly where my father had stood for 30 years, my eyes wide, my breath hitching in my throat, staring into the dark. I was the new witness. I was the new guardian. And as the scratching grew louder, as the static began to hum in the very air around me, I realized that the vanishing wasn't something that happened to you. It was something you spent your entire life trying to delay. I took a deep breath, the smell of ozone and rotting history filling my lungs, and prepared to spend my first night on the watch. The silence in my father's office wasn't an absence of sound, but a heavy, pressurized weight that tasted of ozone and rotting history. As the air began to hum with a low-frequency vibration that rattled my very teeth, I realized that the vanishing wasn't something that happened to you in a single, clean moment of erasure. It was a slow, agonizing erosion of existence, a fate you spent your entire life trying to delay with every ounce of your sanity. I took a deep breath, the scent of old, scorched paper and cold iron filling my lungs, and prepared to spend my first night on the watch. My hand trembled as I smoothed out the top sheet of the classified folder, the facility conduct notes staring back at me like a death warrant written in sterile, bureaucratic font. I looked out the window, the same pane of glass my father had stared through for 40 years until his eyes grew milky and his spirit turned to ash. Outside, the world was a study in monochromatic dread. The moonlight was a pale, sickly infection, casting long, distorted shadows across the overgrown grass of the backyard. The shadows didn't move with the wind. They seemed to stretch and contraction with a life of their own, like the reaching limbs of something drowning in the earth. This was his legacy. Not the house, not the pension, but this jagged, visceral responsibility to stand between the domestic world and the howling void he had helped curate at NASA. Rule 1 was the foundation, a warning that felt like a hook in my throat. Never talk about Roswell. My father's notes didn't speak of flying saucers or little grey men with almond eyes. He spoke of a massive, messy containment failure. The Roswell event was a puncture wound in the skin of reality, a place where the physics of our world met the rotting logic of another. He wrote that the crash was just the beginning, the cleanup was a slaughter. But the true horror wasn't the event itself, but the visibility. Talking about it, even in whispers, was like lighting a flare in a dark forest full of predators. To acknowledge the truth of Roswell was to announce your coordinates to the things that were actively silencing the narrative. I felt it then, a prickle of static on my skin, the sensation of 1,000 unseen eyes turning toward this house, drawn by the mere fact that I was now a witness to the secret. The hum in the air grew louder, a jagged vibration that felt like a finger tracing the line of my spine. I turned the page, my fingers slick with cold sweat. Rule 2. If you see green slugs in the break room, never use salt. There was a photo clipped to the margin, a grainy, high-contrast shot of a janitor's locker. The floor was covered in a thick, translucent ichor. My father's handwriting was frantic here, the ink bleeding into the paper. He described an incident in 1984 where a maintenance worker had encountered the anomalous mollusks near a venting duct. Thinking they were common pests, the man had poured a canister of salt on them. The salt hadn't dissolved them. It had acted as a biological trigger, a key that unlocked a dormant, predatory geometry within their soft bodies. They didn't die. They mutated. They tore themselves open from the inside out, turning into frantic, multi-limbed horrors that didn't consume flesh so much as they unmade it. The janitor's remains weren't found in one piece. He was scattered across the dimensions of the room, his DNA rewritten into the very grout of the tiles. I looked at the dark corners of the office, half expecting to see a trail of glowing slime, a green omen of a mutation waiting to be triggered by a simple human instinct. The third rule was a hollow ache in my chest. Do not ask about missing scientists. The folder contained a list of names, but as I ran my eyes over them, the ink seemed to shimmer and fade. Dr. Aries, Dr. Miller. These weren't just men who had been fired. They were men who had been flawlessly erased. Their employee IDs led to dead servers. Their home addresses were now vacant lots or parks that had supposedly been there for decades. Arthur's notes warned that asking about a missing colleague wasn't seen as a gesture of concern. It was treated as volunteering. In the facility, curiosity was a terminal illness. If you noticed the hole someone left behind, the system decided you were the perfect candidate to fill it. I wondered how many of the men in the old photos on the wall were already gone, their faces preserved in silver nitrate while their souls were scrubbed from the timeline. The vanishing was a silent predator, and it was always hungry for more data points. I leaned back, the leather of my father's chair groaning like a dying animal. Rule 4 spoke of the grand deception, the illusion of oversight. NASA, or the entity operating under its skin, was a master of the stage. My father detailed how they orchestrated fake tours for government officials, building entire wings of the facility that were nothing but hollow shells and actors in lab coats. They let the senators and the generals see what they expected to see: high-tech computers, shiny rockets, and men in white shirts. It was a pantomime of progress designed to hide the truly anomalous layers where the walls bled and the clocks ran backward. They manipulated the people in power into believing they had total access, ensuring the check writers never looked under the floorboards where the real work was being done. The facility wasn't just a place of science. It was a cathedral of lies built to house things that couldn't be governed by man-made laws. A sudden, sharp memory of our old dog, Barnaby, hit me as I read Rule 5. Never bring your dog to work. There was an incident log from a Sunday in 1987. My father had brought Barnaby into the office during the off hours. The log described how the dog, usually a boisterous, happy animal, had suddenly collapsed in front of an unmarked door in the secondary basement. He hadn't tripped. He had been paralyzed by a profound, invisible terror that humans simply weren't wired to detect. The dog had stared at the empty air, his eyes rolling back in his head, whining a sound that my father described as the pitch of a soul being shredded. The air in front of that door wasn't empty to the dog. It was occupied by something so ancient and predatory that the animal's primal instincts had simply short-circuited. I realized then why my father had never let me play in the yard after sunset, and why he had looked at our pets with a strange, mourning pity. They were the only ones who knew the true shape of the dark. And then there was the final rule, the one that explained the heavy bolt on the front door and the bars on the windows. Rule 6. Never let your child out alone after dark. My father had spent years mapping the patterns, cross-referencing missing children reports with cattle mutilations and localized spikes in electromagnetic static. He discovered that the entities don't hunt at random. They follow the lines of the earth, the places where the light of civilization grows thin. They prey on targets that wander just far enough away from the safety of structures, the ones who think they are alone in the night. They don't kill out of hunger, they harvest. They look for the outliers, the ones whose absence won't be immediately noticed until it's too late. The notes were illustrated with sketches of things that look like spindly, elongated shadows with too many joints, crouching in the branches of trees, waiting for a child to take that one extra step into the tall grass. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I looked around the office, seeing the piles of notebooks, the telescopes aimed not at the stars but at the tree line, and the half-empty cups of cold coffee. My father hadn't been a distant, work-obsessed man because he didn't love me. He had been a sentry. Every night of my childhood, while I slept in the comfort of my bed, he had been standing here, his eyes burning with exhaustion, watching the yard. He had been a human lighthouse, casting a flicker of awareness against a tide of cosmic predators that were waiting for a single moment of inattention to snatch me away. He had traded his peace, his health, and his sanity to keep the dark from crossing the threshold. I stood up and walked to the window. The pale moonlight was still there, casting those long, distorted shadows on the lawn. One of the shadows seemed to detach itself from the base of the old oak tree. It moved with a sickening, liquid grace, a patch of void that was darker than the night surrounding it. It paused, sensing my presence, sensing that the old watchman was gone and a new, unproven one had taken his place. The air began to vibrate again, the hum rising into a low, discordant shriek that only I could hear. The smell of ozone returned, sharper now, like the scent of a storm that would never break. The vanishing wasn't a moment. It was a process. And as I gripped the cold latch of the window, staring into the pulsing dark of the yard, I felt the first layer of my old life peel away. The house felt like a cage, but it was the only cage that could keep me safe. The notes on the desk were no longer just papers. They were the instructions for a survival I had never asked for. I reached out and turned off the desk lamp, plunging the room into shadow, leaving only the eerie, bone-white light from the moon to guide my eyes. My father's watch had ended, and the entities were testing the perimeter, smelling the air for the scent of my fear. I took a deep breath, the taste of rotting history thick on my tongue, and narrowed my eyes at the tree line. I would not look away. I would not go outside. I would stay in the dark, watching the dark, until the sun clawed its way back over the horizon. The watch was mine now. And God help me, I finally understood why he never smiled. The lamp on the desk flickered, its amber glow struggling against the encroaching tide of the night pressing hard against the window panes. I sat in my father's chair, a heavy, leather-bound throne that smelled of stale tobacco and the metallic tang of old coins. My fingers trembled as I smoothed out the yellowed edges of the folder. This wasn't just a collection of memos. This was a ledger of the impossible, a map of the shadows that had lived in the periphery of my childhood. I looked at the notes on Roswell first. My father's handwriting, usually a disciplined, architectural script, had devolved into a frantic scrawl in those margins. He didn't write about flying saucers or little grey men. He wrote about a spill. He described it like a shattered jar of ink in a pool of clear water, a contaminant that didn't just sit there, but stained the very logic of the geography it touched. The warning was visceral. Talking about it wasn't a breach of security. It was a biological invitation. He wrote that the sound of the word Roswell resonated at a frequency those things could track. To speak of it was to light a flare in a world of sightless predators. I felt a sudden, irrational urge to swallow my own tongue, terrified that even the silent echo of the thought in my skull might be enough to draw a gaze from the void. Then there were the slugs. The classified photos taped to the back of the second page made my stomach turn. They looked like emerald bile, translucent and shimmering with a sickly, rhythmic pulse. The janitor, a man named Miller, hadn't known better. He had seen a pest and reached for a canister of industrial salt. The notes described the reaction not as a death, but as an awakening. The salt hadn't dried them out. It had acted as a catalyst, a chemical key that unlocked a dormant, jagged geometry within their soft bodies. The photos showed the aftermath. The break room walls weren't just covered in gore, they were structurally rewritten. The slugs had expanded into crystalline lattices of bone and wet, vibrating silk, tearing Miller into pieces that didn't even look human anymore. My father had written one word in red ink at the bottom of that report: catalysis. Some things in this world are only waiting for the right mistake to become monsters. I shifted in the chair, the leather creaking like a groan from the floorboards below. The rule about the missing scientists hit me with a cold, bureaucratic finality. Rule 3 wasn't about safety, it was about the economy of existence. My father's notes detailed the erasure protocol. He'd kept a list of names, men and women I dimly remembered from Christmas parties, people who had laughed and smelled of expensive perfume or cheap aftershave. Then, one Tuesday, their parking spots would be empty. Their files would be replaced by blank sheets of vellum. When he asked a supervisor about Dr. Aristone, the man had simply looked through him, his eyes like flat grey marbles, and asked if my father was volunteering for the next cycle. The horror wasn't in the disappearance itself, but in the silence that followed. NASA wasn't losing people, they were pruning the reality of their own staff. To acknowledge the vacancy was to invite the shears. I turned the page to the section on government oversight, and a bitter laugh escaped my throat. The audacity of it was breathtaking. My father described the Potemkin labs. When the senators and the committees came knocking with their badges and their arrogance, the facility would transform. They had entire floors dedicated to a grand, expensive theater of the mundane. They showed the official shiny rockets and boring telemetry data while, 3 levels below, the air was screaming and the physics were bleeding out. They fed the government the lie of competence to hide the truth of their desperation. The officials left feeling powerful, never realizing they had been walking through a cardboard stage set designed by men who were terrified of what was rattling the handles of the doors they weren't allowed to see. My eyes drifted to a Polaroid tucked into the fold. It was Buster, our old golden retriever, standing in a hallway that looked like it belonged in a hospital but felt like it belonged in a tomb. The dog's hackles were raised, his legs locked in a state of rigid, muscular paralysis. He wasn't barking at a person or a sound. He was staring at a plain, unmarked door, room 402. My father's note underneath read, "He can see the pressure change. We are blind to the weight of the air." Buster had never been the same after that day at the office. He had spent the rest of his life sleeping with his back against the wall, his eyes never truly closing, always watching the doorways of our house with a profound, soul-deep suspicion. Now, sitting in this room, I felt that same invisible weight. The air in the study felt heavy, as if the oxygen was being replaced by something denser, something ancient and cold. Finally, I reached the last rule, the one about the dark. My father had spent years analyzing maps, not of the stars, but of the mundane. He mapped cattle mutilations, missing hikers, and children who vanished from their own backyards. He found a pattern that defied logic but obeyed a predatory geometry. These entities, whatever they were, didn't hunt in the deep woods or the high mountains. They hunted the fringes. They waited for that moment when a person stepped just 3 feet too far from the porch light, or when a child wandered toward the tall grass at the edge of the fence. They were opportunists of the threshold. They thrived in the between spaces. I looked up from the folder and stared at the window. The reflection of the desk lamp danced on the glass, a tiny, flickering candle against an ocean of absolute black. Outside, the tree line was a jagged silhouette against a starless sky. The wind hissed through the leaves, sounding less like nature and more like a long, drawn-out whisper. I realized then that the office wasn't a place of work. It was a bunker. The desk was positioned so he could see the entire yard. The high-powered spotlights he'd installed on the eaves weren't for security against burglars. They were a territorial claim. They were a barrier of photons meant to keep the between from encroaching on the here. The melancholy all washed over me, thick and suffocating. I thought of my father standing here, night after night, his hair turning white, his eyes growing hard and shadowed. He wasn't distant because he didn't love me. He was distant because he was a soldier in a war that had no end and no medals. He was the thin, human line between his family and the hungry static of the universe. I reached out and touched the cool glass of the window. Somewhere out there, past the reach of the porch light, something moved. It wasn't a deer or a stray dog. It was a ripple in the darkness, a momentary distortion of the shadows that suggested a shape far too large and far too thin. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum in the silence of the room. I didn't turn away. I couldn't. The legacy was in my blood now. The rules weren't just instructions. They were a survival manual for a world I had only just begun to see. I felt the weight of his old binoculars on the sideboard, the cold steel of the flashlight in the drawer. The house felt different now. The walls weren't just wood and plaster, they were a hull, and we were drifting through a sea of monsters. I reached for the lamp and turned the dial, increasing the brightness until the room was washed in a harsh, clinical glare. I would not let the shadows gain an inch. I would sit in this chair, the leather cooling beneath me, and I would watch the perimeter. I would memorize the sway of every branch and the position of every stone. The sun was hours away. The void was patient, but so was I. I took a deep breath, the scent of rotting history thick on my tongue, and narrowed my eyes at the tree line. I would not look away. I would not go outside. I would stay in the dark, watching the dark, until the sun clawed its way back over the horizon. The watch was mine now. And God help me, I finally understood why he never smiled. I reached for a pen and a fresh sheet of paper. My hand was steady now, the tremor replaced by a cold, hard resolve. I didn't write a letter of grief or a final will. I began to draw the yard. I mapped the reach of the lights. I noted the blind spots behind the shed and the way the shadows pulled in the crawlspace vent. If I was to be the watchman, I would be a meticulous one. The silence of the house was no longer empty. It was filled with the presence of what my father had left behind. I could almost feel him standing behind me, a ghostly hand on my shoulder, his gaze fixed on the same patch of blackness beyond the glass. We were the silent sentinels, the keepers of the light, the only ones who knew that the world didn't end at the horizon. It ended wherever the light failed. And as the first hint of grey began to bleed into the eastern sky, I realized that I would never truly sleep again. The night was too wide, and the things that lived in it were far too hungry. But as long as I stood my ground, as long as I followed the rules, the dark would have to wait. The watch continues. It always continues. And in the pale, shivering light of the dawn, I saw a single, green, translucent smear on the outside of the windowpane. It vibrated with a faint, rhythmic pulse. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I simply reached for the heavy roll of industrial tape and the bottle of vinegar I'd moved to the desk. I had work to do. I had a legacy to protect. And the sun, though it was rising, felt colder than it ever had before.